The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Now, the United Nations Nuclear Agency says Iran has turned all of its enriched uranium closest to the level needed to make nuclear arms into more harmless forms. The conversion of its stock of 20% enriched uranium was part of a deal to curb Iran's nuclear program. The United States said last week that it would unblock $2.8 billion in frozen Iranian funds. This was in return for Iran's compliance. Also, a 4-month extension to talks on Iran's nuclear ambitions was agreed between Iran and world powers. They now have until November the 20th to secure a deal to curb the Islamic Republic's nuclear program, and this would be in exchange for lifting sanctions. The new deadline marks a year from when the countries first signed a joint plan of action to try to find a permanent solution. Iran insists it is enriching uranium for use in nuclear power stations and for medical purposes. At a time of great instability in the region, is this a positive move from the Islamic Republic? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Anasiba Siri-Tabrizi. She's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. On the line from Tehran is Dr. Mohammad Marandi. He's an associate professor at the University of Tehran, and also on the line is Alistair Crook. He's a former advisor to the High Representative at the European Union, Javier Solana, and he's also the founder and director of the Conflicts Forum. That's a group which works for engagement between political Islam and the West. And on the line from Paris, Nazanin Ansari. She's the managing editor of Kayhan London. That's a weekly Persian language newspaper. A warm welcome to you all. I guess we'll go over the terms of the deal first. Dr. Marandi, I'll turn to you. I mean, I guess there was a lot discussed, but Iran will take further steps to neutralizing its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. It will get relief on some kind of secondary sanctions. This includes $700 million a month in old oil revenue from foreign bank accounts, among other things. I mean, do you think this is a fair deal for Iran so far? Will they be happy with this?
Well, it's not a fair deal by any means. The Iranians have enriched uranium at 20% at the very beginning, simply because the United States forced the IAEA into not providing Iran with the nuclear fuel that it needed for the Tehran experimental reactor, which produces medical isotopes for cancer patients, thus putting at risk almost 1 million patients a year. And the United States basically did this to put pressure on the Iranian government. So the Iranians, when they saw that they were not getting the nuclear fuel needed, they enriched uranium at 20% themselves and converted much of it into nuclear rods, into fuel rods that is used at the reactor. So it could not have been converted to nuclear weapons anyhow. But in any case, the Iranians and the current administration is looking for a way forward to ease tensions and to create an environment for a political breakthrough. And so it is being flexible so that ultimately the United States and its Western allies will respond favorably and come to a nuclear agreement where Iran's full rights are preserved and also the sanctions are completely lifted.
Nazanin Ansari, I'll turn to you. I mean, there has been comment that there is still considerable distance between the Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and the US Secretary of State, and this is following 10 months of talks. Do you think there's still quite considerable distance between them?
Distance as far as the amount of centrifuges that Iran will ultimately want to keep and wants, according to Ayatollah Khamenei's speech, that it intends to have. Also, I think, although there's a positive atmosphere as far as negotiations are concerned, what remains of concern for people like me is that there has not been a debate in Iran in Farsi as far as the opportunity costs of having this nuclear program, about its safety implications. And only a few weeks ago, when one of Dr. Marandi's colleagues at the University of Tehran, Dr. Ziba Kalam, raised a question about the priority of the country between medical needs, and this nuclear policy, which has invited all these sanctions, he was sentenced to 18 months in jail. So overall, from an Iranian population's perspective, there's a lack of access to access to information and correct information and debate and discussion in Farsi. We are sitting here. Very much I enjoy hearing Dr. Marandi speak in English, discussing and debating these issues with you. But once you go back into Iran, this debate, these discussions are not being carried out. So the general population in Iran, those who do not speak English, are being isolated from whatever is going on outside. And this is my main point of concern. But altogether, obviously, the mood in Iran at the moment is that we have no other choice, but we have to reach a positive conclusion to this policy that has really isolated Iran from an economic perspective and a financial perspective. And so I hope within the next 4 months, both sides will be able to reach an agreement to move things forward.
Okay, well, it's fair to get Dr. Morandi's response to that. What do you make of that claim that there is not really enough debate in Farsi, in Iran itself, among the people about what these talks signify?
Well, actually, your guest has made a number of mistakes there. First of all, there's a great deal of debate. In fact, the current administration sometimes complains that there is too much debate. Dr. Ziba Kalam, she is referring to, actually opposes the current flexibility being shown by the government, and Dr. Ziba Kalam believes that Iran should continue with the nuclear program and ignore, more or less, some of the demands that the United States and its allies are making. And, of course, Dr. Ziba Kalam is not in prison. He is an academic at the University of Tehran, and he teaches.
That's what I said. That's what I said, Dr. Marandi, that he's your colleague in Tehran, in Iran.
Very differing views. In fact, the two, just as an example, give a better understanding to your listeners. There are two Dr. Ziba Kalams at the University of Tehran. One is very pro-negotiations, and one is very hostile towards the negotiations. And or very hostile, very critical. So this shows the degree of the debate that exists in Iran.
Adding to that debate, and I will bring in Alistair and Anasi in a minute, but just back to you, Dr. Morandi. I mean, I suppose it was interesting for us in the West seeing the foreign minister address people in English on YouTube, which is an outlet frowned upon by former President Ahmadinejad, and he was making the point that Iran needs to come to some kind of solution. And also interesting, he was saying, imagine being forbidden from doing what everybody else is doing. It was quite a plaintive call in English, and it got a lot of pickup on YouTube. Is this a different approach from the administration?
Well, I think one of the reasons why Foreign Minister Dr. Zarif made this video was, first of all, because he's very fluent in English, and second of all, because the mainstream media in the West rarely allows Iran to have its say among the Western public. And therefore, he thought that he would choose an approach where he could have, or people could have direct access to him and the Iranian logic. If one looks at how the nuclear program has been presented to the American public or to the public in much of Europe, you will see that there's a great deal of scaremongering, fear-mongering, and attempts to put fear into the hearts of ordinary people in order to justify very brutal sanctions against ordinary Iranians. The sanctions that the United States has imposed upon Iran, with the help of its Western allies, are unprecedented, and they have led to the deaths of many innocent children, cancer patients in this country, and people who are unable to access some of the medicines that we didn't have for a very long period of time because of the sanctions.
But the sanctions have been softened, and the softening of sanctions, the release of nearly $3 billion in frozen assets, will make quite a considerable impact. I mean, they have. You couldn't say that Iran has walked away from the talks last week with nothing in hand.
No, the Iranians, I believe, the current administration is taking more or less the right approach. But no, the sanctions have not been lifted. The sanctions that the United States has imposed unilaterally on the Iranian central bank has made importing much more difficult than before. Therefore, for example, medicines that the Iranians need are brought in through a very difficult process, thus making them much more expensive and sometimes inaccessible. The Iranian assets that have been seized by the United States or other countries under American pressure, they are roughly $100 billion. And the Iranian government, it runs a country of 80 million people. $3 billion is really not very much. The point for Iran is not so much the $3 billion, but to show that Iran is doing everything possible to the international community, that it is not Iran that is preventing the issue from being resolved. The current administration has been flexible. The previous administration had been flexible because there was a lot of access to the Iranian nuclear installations before, but this administration has increased it even further in order to show through this flexibility that the ball really is in the American court.
Okay, well, look, I'll bring in Alistair Crook now. You were a former advisor to Javier Solana, and he was High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy at the EU, and he mediated with the Iranians when you were there. Do you notice any kind of different atmosphere with these particular talks compared to the times of previous negotiations?
No, unfortunately, I don't. And in fact, I think that in some respects, they're following the same course that led to the failures in 2004 and 2005. The argument is still the old argument that Iran should not be allowed enrichment, or at least it should not be allowed enrichment sufficiently, as it's characterized now, to come to a breakout capacity. So the essence of the issues that is still going on is whether that Iran can have no more than a sort of token pilot project of enrichment, perhaps enough to light up a city, or what Iran is asking and wanting, which is the ability to provide nuclear energy for its industry and for its state as a whole. And that requires industrial scale enrichment. The P5+1 still remain adamantly opposed to that on the old grounds, the old dogma that inherited from RAND organization, that you cannot materially distinguish between weapons enrichment and peaceful enrichment. And of course, and I think this is my complaint really about the EU at the time, they should have challenged this doctrine from the beginning, because of course you can. Of course you can distinguish peaceful processes of enrichment. And indeed, this is the point that the Iranians made in 2004 to the EU3 negotiators at that point, and say, of course you can do this, and we can agree this with you. But that time, Blair said no. That was the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said no, there must be no enrichment. Now we have moved solely, the only distance we've gone is from 2004. Now we say you can have a pilot project of enrichment, but not industrial enrichment. I don't think it's possible to get an agreement on those terms, and that's the subject of the debate. And if I may just add the last point, I think since you have the representative of the newspaper with you in this conversation, I read the Farsi press regularly on this issue, and actually it's a very vigorous debate. Why there haven't been all the details of the negotiations is both sides to the negotiations entered into a pact of silence about the negotiations throughout the course of the negotiations. So you heard complaints. The complaints have just been as vigorous in Ceyhan as anywhere else about the lack of details and information coming out about the course of the negotiations.
If I may,
not because they object to the negotiations, but they object to the structure and the course of the direction.
Go ahead, Nazanin.
If I may, first of all, just to point out that our publication, Ceyhan London, is not allowed to distribute in Iran, and it's very different as far as editorial-wise from the Ceyhan in Iran. Also, since 2005, there has been a blanket ban on discussions, for example, on questions such as, to what degree does the use of nuclear energy have an environmental justification in Iran? That has not. Most of these reactors are built on fault lines. Iran is prone to earthquakes. What are the lessons that have been learned from Chernobyl and Fukushima? This has not been debated. Do disasters such as Chernobyl also threaten nuclear plants in Iran, which is prone to earthquakes? Why hasn't the government of Iran joined nuclear safety protocols? What is the environmental impact of Iran's nuclear policy? What is the cost of building each nuclear power plant? I can go on and on and on. This question has affected Iranian livelihood, and those are the people, general public. But the debates are not being done either on TV, where most of the Iranian population receive their information from, or it's done within a very close circle of elite. Now, at the end of the day, the Iranian government comes and says that nuclear energy is our right. What kind of right? What are our other rights? What is, for example, the rights to nuclear energy? How does it, whether it coincides with a right, for example, to live in a better environment or to have less political pressure? There's nothing to do with human rights or nuclear energy, any cross-cultural debate going on inside Iran. That is the point I'm making. If I may just add one other point, the level of duplicity that is going on inside the Iranian government with the population, just one point of it. For example, in the negotiations, the negotiating team has in effect agreed to implement the additional protocol measures as long as they are not termed as additional protocol inside Iran. So once again, they are willing to cooperate with the international community to lessen the sanctions, but they do not want to be honest and upfront with the Iranian public, general public, and that is where I'm coming from. That is my debate. Thank you.
Interesting on the point of the environmental aspects of... Dr. Marandi, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think your guest really knows very little about Iran. We've actually had a number of seminars at the University of Tehran, and as far as I recall, at least one major conference on the nuclear issue and all aspects of the nuclear program, as well as issues related to safety, issues related to the fact that many parts of Iran are prone to earthquakes. So that's obviously...
Yes, it has been in the educational, in the universities. No, that's my point. Exactly.
Allow me to speak. I mean, the point is that when you put forward a false argument, you're going to suffer the consequences. So be more careful about how you put forward.
Okay, look, she denies she's making a false argument, but just finish your point, Dr. Marandi, please.
You know, the debate in Iran has... No, she said that there is no debate in Iran. There is a very open debate in Iran.
General public, sir. General public, Dr. Marandi, and my name is Nazanin.
At these conferences, the media is present, newspapers are present, the legitimate Kehan, whose logo you use illegally, they are present, and so are reformist newspapers, as well as pro-government newspapers, and government newspapers critical of the government. All of these are present at these seminars. They are not closed to the public or to the media.
Okay. Well, look, I think...
A final point that I'd like to make is that the Iranians know exactly what the Iranian government has offered to do during the negotiations. It has been discussed in newspapers, the greater amount of access that's been given to the Iranian nuclear program. And this is a given to Iranians. They know exactly what is going on. And that is why there's such a fierce debate going on in the country. Some people are highly critical of what the government has done, and some are supportive. And I think that really the argument is that Western governments are the governments that have imposed illegal sanctions on Iran. They have killed, violated fundamental human rights in this country. And by making excuses and trying to blame the victim, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
Okay, fair enough. Well, you've made your point there. And just Anasi, you've been sitting there very patiently, and I appreciate that. You're visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And just a couple of points that Nazanin pointed out there about, say, environmental concerns and all those kinds of things, earthquake risks and all that kind of stuff. I mean, is that a focus of what the European Union wants? Are they really, or is what the EU wants in these particular talks, does that simply chime with, say, US interests and the other P5+1 group?
Well, this is basically what has happened, at least in the last 4 years. Since 2010, the EU has strongly aligned with the US position. Since 2006, we have had the dual-track approach of dialogue and pressure with the use of sanctions. And since then, I can say that the debate on any other issue beside the nuclear issue has not been taking place.
Yeah. So when the joint statement with Catherine Ashton with the Iranians seemed to suggest, I suppose, in some circles it was interpreted as perhaps, maybe the Rouhani administration achieved in 100 days what Ahmadinejad could not achieve in 8 years. Did the European Union feel that some kind of progress had been made?
I think so, definitely. I think the Europeans were very skeptical about the possibility of any change or improvement of relation or in the nuclear issue resolution after the election of Rouhani. But I think this feeling has changed in the last months, and we could definitely feel that after November 24th, when the interim agreement was signed. We have seen a great amount of visits from foreign ministers, parliamentary delegation. Catherine Ashton visited Iran for the first time in March since her mandate started in 2010. So I think definitely the Rouhani factor has played a big role in making a change in the EU perspective and vision of Iran and the possibility of a resolution of the nuclear issue.
But, I mean, can we read too much into or can we interpret anything from, say, the absence of the Russian foreign minister in the talks in Vienna? Even the Chinese foreign minister wasn't there for the last part of the talks. I mean, is it really kind of focusing on the EU and the European side of things rather than Russia and China?
I don't think so. The situation has changed in terms of what role the EU is playing right now. In 2003-2005, it was basically the Europeans playing a mediating role between Iran and the US. Now is the EU playing a mediating role within the whole E3+3 more than between Iran and the US. And the situation, of course, is more difficult right now with all the international crises that are going on, especially the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But I don't think that the Europeans are playing any different role or even that they are sidelined by any kind of special bilateral relation between the US and Iran. I think the fact that Catherine Ashton, according to rumors, is going to play her stewardship role even after the end of her mandate at the end of October, so up until the new deadline of the agreement, the 24th of November, I think it's a sign the Europeans will play their role up until this situation is hopefully solved.
But Alistair Crook, I mean, from what you were saying before, you don't seem to think much progress has been made. And in fact, I mean, as been alluded to, the Ayatollah Khamenei said that Iran must be able to produce enough enriched uranium to fuel the Bushehr nuclear reactor that's built by Russia when the contract with Russia to supply fuel runs out in 2021. I guess this is being interpreted by, say, the US Congress, which is the US does have to agree to any kind of deal, as Iran not really backing down at all and playing for time. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, what I do think in the reference to the last question, too, is that Europe has been dramatically changed, really, by the openness and the negotiations and the foreign ministers' attempt to get an agreement. But they simply have not been able to get past this issue of breakout capacity, which is really an artificial block, which has been introduced by many of those elements that are opposed to a deal with Iran. And simply to try and ask Iran, which has 19,000 centrifuges, to cut it down to a few hundred or perhaps 3,000 or 5,000, whatever the final figure is, I think is just not realistic. So that if the EU is serious, and I think they are, I do believe that now is the time to have an arrangement to normalize relations with Iran. You've seen the British open the embassy there finally. Then they have to address this fundamental issue. Is Iran going to have not just a token pilot project run out of a sort of university, or is it going to have be allowed to have a proper nuclear power structure? If it is, then of course all those other issues about how and earthquakes and environment, of course, will come out. But it's all very hypothetical, and if you haven't got the right to a nuclear power anyway. So I think the EU have got to do much more in its relationship with America and in concert with Russia and Iran and China to get a solution.
So, Anasi, do you think that kind of progress can be made over the next 4 months between until the next deadline?
I think that there is some hope that this issue can be solved. I think the mere fact that they are still talking and they didn't break the negotiation on 20th of July, and that even someone who is normally very critical of what is going on, Foreign Minister Fabius, encouraged the continuation of talks for the 4 months, gives us some hope that there is room for maneuver and for an agreement to be reached by the deadline. As Alistair said, there are great disagreement and great gaps, especially on the capability and enrichment front. But maybe there could be compromise with other areas of disagreement, which are the length of the agreement, which on one side is to be discussed between 5 and 8 years, and the Iranian side. The Iranian side is proposing 5 to 8 years, whereas the P5+1 side is proposing 10 to 20 years, according to rumors. And this, the nature and the scale of the sanction relief, which are, again, an area of disagreement and which have not been solved. However, I think that there is, basically, according to what Arakchi said, the fact that 65% of the text has been agreed on, and that the remaining 35% is basically core issues that remain to be solved, but that there is some room of maneuver to solve this, gives us hope that there is the possibility also disagreement on the capability enrichment front.
But there's also disagreement, Dr. Morandi, in US Congress, and they're not really supporting what John Kerry, the kind of mood music coming from these talks, and the United Against a Nuclear Iran, that's a bipartisan group in Congress, is very critical of Barack Obama. They still insist Iran has not shown a willingness to dismantle any of its uranium enrichment capabilities. So if they're not convinced, there really isn't any hope for any kind of agreement, is there?
Well, Iran is not going to dismantle its peaceful nuclear program. As President Rouhani said recently, Iran will not accept nuclear apartheid. So ultimately, Western negotiators have to come to this recognition that Iran is not going to forfeit its right as a sovereign and independent country. I would also like to add a couple of things. And one is that there is a sharp disagreement within the P5+1. Russia and China have positions that are much closer to Iran, especially as time goes by. And Europe is becoming, from the view of Iranians, much less independent. In other words, British and the Germans and the French are not really all that much different from the United States in their negotiating position. So the real problem from the Iranian perspective is the United States. And remember, the sanctions that have been imposed upon Iran, the overwhelming majority of sanctions are unilateral sanctions by the United States government that European countries have also supported. And according to American laws that Congress has passed, third parties, for example, Russia, they are not allowed to have a banking relationship with Iran. In other words, the United States Congress has imposed regulations upon Russia, upon China, and other countries, which is also violates their own sovereignty. If the United States government wants to come to an agreement with Iran ultimately and recognize Iran's sovereign rights, which is what needs to be done for an agreement to be reached, they have to solve the problem of Congress, not Iran.
Nazanin Ansari, can I just ask you, I mean, certainly it's a turbulent region, obviously, in the march of ISIS in Iraq and parts of Syria. It seems like Congress is backing, or is not going to back, it's increased funding for the Free Syrian Army to tackle Bashar al-Assad. So I'm wondering, the United States needs Iran now in a way that it didn't before. And I'm wondering if you think this possibly has some kind of dimension in terms of the talks. The United States may have to turn to Iran to help them tackle ISIS.
Well, certainly in that region, Iran is now an island of stability. If you look at Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. So certainly that is done. But the United States has always needed Iran, and Iran has always needed the United States. So that, I think, that's why in both countries there are forces and there are personalities that have been working towards this rapprochement and a re-establishment of relations. And I really do hope that at one point that within Iran we can have the debate about does the right to nuclear energy interfere with other rights, such as the right to live in a healthy environment, the right to economic well-being, the right to good health. I hope we can have debates about and access to information about why these reactors are built on fault lines, earthquake fault lines, and what is the end game for the Iranian government and the Islamic Republic at the end of the day. Just to have a nuclear energy program, because for what reason in a country where there's plenty of water, where there's plenty of sun, where we are blessed with natural resources, why embark on such a policy of confrontation with the world? Now, obviously, there are those who disagree with me, and certainly at the moment, the state in Iran, the policy does disagree with what I am saying right now. But there are people inside Iran who are wondering about these questions, and I hope Dr. Morandi will organize more of these discussions and debates that he has been probably, quote unquote, organizing in the University of Tehran, and give access to TV stations, to the BBC TV station, to the BBC Persian, to VOA Persian, to Radio Zamaneh, to all of these free media outside of Iran, to have access to those debates that are going on inside Iran.
Okay, and Dr. Morandi, I know you have addressed the media issue, but I just want to ask you finally, is a long-term solution to Iran's nuclear ambitions a long way off? Can we expect something to happen by the next deadline?
Well, first, I'd just very briefly like to say the Iranian media has been blocked in Western countries, and, for example, Press TV, Al-Alam, other Iranian news networks have been prevented from being broadcast across the globe under American pressure. So this battle,
No,
media
Dr.
battle,
Maran,
working
sorry. I do apologize for interjecting, but the reason Press TV
Okay,
in UK was because they attended the Q&A, the questioning of a journalist while he was being interrogated by the security services.
Okay, Nazanin.
And Press TV filmed it.
Okay, fine, Nazanin. I think I'll just have to let Dr. Morandi just carry on. Just on the final question, I mean, I think that there's considerable disagreements over media, how the media is covering the story in Iran itself, and I think we've really addressed that issue. But just on the point of, by the time this next deadline rolls around, is a long-term solution to Iran's nuclear ambitions possible?
Well, I hope so. It largely depends on the United States and its allies, its Western allies, if they are willing to break from the past and to respect Iran's sovereignty. The current narrative in the West is, of course, very different from the narrative that you see in Tehran, and that's, of course, because the Western media doesn't cover the country. The United States and the Europeans have to come to this, that the Iranian people will not relinquish their sovereignty. The Iranians, when Saddam Hussein invaded the country, they fought for 8 years to defend their sovereignty. They're not going to allow the United States and other hegemonic countries to deprive Iran of its nuclear rights.
Okay, and
the safety of the Iranian nuclear program was, of course, probably assessed when the Americans built the infrastructure of the Iranian nuclear program before the revolution. So these issues about safety and so on are excuses in order to put increased pressure on Iran.
Okay, Alistair Crook, I mean, the point there that Dr. Morandi was making was, it seems like sovereignty is inextricably linked with Iran's nuclear program. So given that, they won't want to make too many concessions. Perhaps a long-term solution to Iran's nuclear ambitions is still a long way off.
I don't think they can give very many concessions. I mean, clearly during the course of this last negotiations, Iran has made many concessions now against the prospect of concessions to be offered by the United States maybe 10 years, 20 years' time or something. But ultimately, I mean, you cannot actually compromise. If you want an industrial enrichment program for nuclear-based energy for peaceful purposes on an industrial scale, you cannot accept the sort of demands being made by the West of 3,000 or 5,000 old-style centrifuges. It just doesn't work. It's not possible. So whereas, yes, there's been trade-off in some of the periphery issues, the West still has not addressed the key issue, and if it doesn't address it, which there's no sign that it's addressing it at the moment, then there will be no agreement at the end of the 4 months.
But, Annecy, just finally, the EU will be holding out some kind of hope that there will be an agreement.
Of course, I think the fact that both sides demonstrated full compliance on their obligation under the joint plan of action gives us some hope that they are fully committed on both sides to also reach an agreement and fully comply with their obligation under this agreement. I think that the fact that Dr. Morandi was mentioning about the US being the tricky point in what will happen is very true. However, the Obama administration in the past months has been very adamant in keeping Congress and holding up from imposing new sanctions, even if they were already talking about that in January. So I think the next 4 months will show us what are really the commitment of the two sides. But so far, both sides have demonstrated that they are fully committed in reaching an agreement by the deadline.
Watch this space. Well, many thanks. That's Anas Basiri Tabrisi. She's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. On the line from Tehran, Dr. Mohammad Marandi, Associate Professor at the University of Tehran. Also, Alistair Crook, a former advisor to Javier Solana. He was the High Representative at the European Union. And he's also founder and director of the Conflicts Forum. That's a group which works for engagement between political Islam and the West. And on the line from Paris, Nazanin Ansari, Managing Editor of Kayhan London. That's a weekly Persian language newspaper. Many thanks for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.